In a time when Hollywood makes a habit of changing characters' ethnicities, background, and even gender, and the mutants on the rise in the MCU, perhaps it is time for one of the most prominent mutants in Marvel's catalog, Magneto, to become more diverse. I personally don't mind these aspects of a character being changed as long as it's done tastefully and benefits the story. In the case of Magneto, I believe that an argument can be made for both. Welcome to the Review Desk. I'm Desmond Carrick, and today I'd like to discuss, is it time for a more diverse Magneto? Magneto debuted in the very first issue of the X-Men by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, released in September of 1963. This series would retroactively be renamed Uncanny X-Men. Magneto would go on to become one of the X-Men's most recurring foes and often allies. He has appeared in a number of X-Men multimedia, which has made him recognizable to both comic book readers and non-readers alike. One of the many great things about comic book films is that they allow people who do not read the books to gain knowledge about these marvelous characters. Because of the Fox X-Men films, the average moviegoer is well versed in the history of Magneto. In 2019, at the San Diego Comic-Con, Kevin Feige confirmed that mutants are coming to the MCU.
And there's no time left to talk about mutants. And how
Seeing as how Magneto is one of the most prominent characters in this franchise, it stands to reason that he will potentially appear in future MCU mutant-centric films. There is, however, one major obstacle: the floating timeline. In many forms of fiction, including comic books, there is a plot device called the floating timeline or sliding timescale. This device is used to explain why characters age very little, if at all, despite their stories reflecting new technology or recent events. You could read a 1962 story about Spider-Man where he's 15 years old, and a 2001 story where Peter Parker has just recently graduated college. Outside of comics, a famous example is The Simpsons. The characters have not aged at all, despite the fact that the show has been on for 32 years. The floating timeline also explains why Magneto, a man who was but a child during World War II, now still has the appearance of a middle-aged man in the comics, which presents a problem within the MCU. Unlike the comic books, the MCU for the most part uses fixed dates. The first Guardians of the Galaxy film takes place in 2014, the same year of that film's release, and the second one is set in 2017. Avengers Infinity War was set in 2018, and Avengers Endgame takes place 5 years later in the year 2023. We know that Magneto's abilities, as with most mutants, manifested during puberty. In the comics, this has been established to be shortly after Kristallnacht, which would be 1935. Assuming Magneto would be approximately 12 years old at this point, we can surmise that he was born in 1923. For Magneto to be a Holocaust survivor with most of his history intact, he would need to be 100 years old at the time of Avengers Endgame. Now, there are ways to circumvent this. It could be stated that mutants in the MCU age at a slower rate. He could be from a universe where time moves differently and is not yet 2023, or World War II took place later in life. Magneto, a man of genius-level intellect in the comics, could even be said to have found a means to extend his life in his effort to attain peace for mutants. However, this represents the opportunity for a more interesting alternative. What if Magneto's history was changed to a more recent tragedy? During the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, many African American citizens were killed. A child around 1965, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, would now be in their late 50s, a perfect age for Magneto. If the studio wanted him to be even younger, he could be a survivor of the Gulf War, where citizens of Kuwait had their country invaded and they suffered many casualties. Iraqi citizens suffered great losses as well. While it has been established that ethnically Jewish people resided in Iraq around the time of the Gulf War, this would present an opportunity to make Magneto a Muslim, since this group of people has suffered an influx in prejudice since the September 11 attacks. Tensions between Israel and the state of Palestine could make turning a famously Jewish character to Muslim a very controversial issue. It could lead to unnecessary comparisons of which tragedy was more horrendous, which people have suffered more, which is in itself a moot point. Many find that Magneto being Jewish is such an integral part of who he is that it cannot and should not be changed. Magneto, however, was not always Jewish. Enter Chris Claremont. Believe it or not, Marvel's Mutants were not always the media powerhouse they are today. The X-Men comic had been cancelled in 1970 due to lukewarm reception and poor sales. The series was relaunched in 1975 as Giant-Size X-Men and was later renamed Uncanny X-Men, with Claremont taking over writing duties in 1975. He would go on to write Uncanny X-Men up to 1991, giving him one of the longest and most celebrated stints in the history of comics. It was during this time that Claremont decided to feature Magneto more prominently and sought to give the character more depth. As Claremont himself stated, every significant book in Marvel had its key antagonist. The Fantastic Four had Doctor Doom, Spider-Man had Dr. Octopus, amongst others. Without Magneto, the X-Men had nobody. It is important to note that Claremont himself is of Jewish descent. In 1971, he lived in Israel and researched the history of the Holocaust. This inspired him to make Magneto a Holocaust survivor, which is first hinted at in Uncanny X-Men issue 150, by which time Magneto had only had 36 appearances in the X-Men comic. Magneto at first makes a vague statement about his people being wiped out through genocide, and at the end of the issue he mentions Auschwitz. Seeing his people exterminated during the Holocaust, along with other groups that were deemed ethnically and socially inferior by the Nazis, Magneto vowed to prevent this from happening to his fellow mutants and set out to conquer mankind. The important thing to remember here is that while Magneto is Jewish, he considers himself a mutant first. He does not only fight for mutants of Jewish descent, and he considers Jewish humans, the same as any other humans, inferior. As long as a Magneto who will appear in the MCU fights the good fight for the freedom of mutant kind, he will at his core be the same character. One thing is for certain, that however he's introduced, Feige and his team at Marvel Studios will put the most effort into it, as they always have. What do you think? Can Magneto's ancestry be changed, or is it too much of a defining characteristic that it would be an injustice? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and until the next time.